Hello, everyone. Welcome to Loop and Learn's T1D Speaker Series, a special event and last one of 2022. What a year it's been. We are real honored to have Adam Brown speaking with us today. He is a T1D, like many of us, and author of Bright Spots and Landmines, which is just a fascinating and extraordinarily useful, helpful book. You learn a lot, and he has learned a lot, and he has shared a lot, and I hope this resonates with you as much as it has with most of us. Just about Loop and Learn and our events, we're looking at what we're going to do, if anything, in the coming year. If there's something you'd like to see coming up on Zoom presentations, let us know. For those of you who are new with us, we're focused on tools that help the DIY looping community, as well as useful apps and exciting race research that will impact and improve lives of all of us living with T1D. What did I do here? For all of you who are using any version of a closed loop system, whether it be DIY or commercial, you may want to check out a video presentation we did with Dr. Rehan Lal of Stanford University School of Medicine. He's also a T1D, brother of T1Ds, user of all closed loop systems, both commercial and DIY. And so if you go to the YouTube Loop and Learn channel and search on Rehan Lal, you can see his presentation on limits and cautions of all closed loop systems. He did this on June 5th of this year. Very, very interesting. You can always learn something from Rehan, so might be worth checking out as well. So let's talk about Adam. I'm just so very honored, appreciate the effort he has put into this community. He's lived with type 1 diabetes for over 20 years. I'm sure that's older by now than what I picked up. He is the author of Bright Spots and Landmines, the diabetes guide I wish someone had handed to me. To date, over 300,000 copies, I'm sure that needs to be updated, of Bright Spots and Landmines have been sold and downloaded. And his very popular 42 factors that affect blood sugar is frequently referenced and available as a poster. I think I've heard the number is even higher than 42. I'm sure we could come up with more factors or group them into little categories. From 2010 to 2019, Adam worked at two mission-driven diabetes publications, Close Concerns, which is run by Kelly Close. He worked as head of diabetes technology and connected care, where he wrote extensively about CGMs, automated insulin delivery, mobile apps, wearables, and the latest in diabetes research and care. At diatribe.org, which you should subscribe to, it's a wonderful organization, puts out a lot of good information. He served as senior editor and a regular contributor and author of Adam's Corner, which I read all the time. He's also been a patient advocate, bringing the patient perspective to numerous public venues, including the FDA. We really need that. NIH meetings, international scientific and industry conferences, and local diabetes events. He is a registered associate, this could all be changed too, associate marriage and family therapist in the state of California. He currently works with the Healthy Teen Project, serving teens with eating disorders via individual, group, and family therapy. He has a master's degree in counseling psychology from the Wright Institute and a bachelor's degree from the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania, where I got my MBA. So we have something in common other than diabetes. So I'm going to stop this share, and with that knowledge that he's got both the technical, he's got the advocacy, he understands, and one thing we're most concerned about these days has to do with coping and mental health. I've said this frequently, diabetes is a very difficult disease. It just doesn't stop. You didn't ask for it. It doesn't go away. You don't get a day off. Adam has a different perspective. I think that's helpful, and he also does a lot of work with teens as they transition, and that's a very tricky time for young people, and I just think we can all learn. I've also invited people from Seniors with Sensors to participate if they were interested as well. So the broad spectrum of people living with diabetes is not just kids, not just teens becoming young adults, not just middle-aged people trying to do their career and their family, but also seniors as we age and the fears that we have as we go through life. So I'm going to turn this over to Adam. I am so grateful that you've given us the time and do your magic. Thank you so much.
Well, gosh, thank you for such a lovely introduction. That's incredibly kind, and takes me down memory lane, because it's been a couple of years that I've been really outside of the diabetes community, kind of diving into psychology and mental health and stepping towards becoming a licensed therapist. So it's nice to re-engage a little bit. And so I'm really happy to be here. And Loop was such a transformative product for me, calling it a product, transformative system or approach. And so it's really nice to connect with a group of loopers too. So I will screen share for a little bit, just share some things that are often on my mind. And then I think we'll open it up to Q&A and see how that goes. So let me do that now. Okay, is that visible? Oh, let me full screen. Is that visible, like as a full screen?
Yes, absolutely.
Awesome. Okay, so I think many folks on here have probably seen this. This is something I compiled probably 4 or 5 years ago at this point. It really began when I got on CGM in 2010 and just started noticing how much affected my blood sugar, how much more it was beyond food and exercise and medication. And the original list was 22 factors. And then over time, I just kept going to diabetes conferences and reading research and testing things in my own life. And so it expanded to 42. And now that I've done kind of a 3-year study in mental health, I think it's probably 100 factors if we add things like access, financial factors, employment, genetic things. You know, there's a huge list of things that impact diabetes. And there's so many reasons why I think this graphic is valuable. One, I think in a single page, it captures the complexity of what we all deal with. And diabetes really demands that we be not just people with diabetes, but amateur physiologists and amateur supply chain managers and amateur pharmacists and amateur dietitians and amateur exercise physiologists and amateur data scientists. And I think this graphic really captures like how many part-time jobs diabetes asks us to take on and how confusing it is to make sense of it all. You'll notice that you know, the arrows kind of reflect the general way that factor seems to affect my blood sugar, or at least like what the research kind of suggests. And just take a notice of how many have up and down arrows, you know, things like alcohol, meal timing, exercise. And I think what's incredibly frustrating about diabetes is how you can do the same thing 2 days in a row and get different results. And you know, to me, this graphic really captures the complexity of that we all deal with. And, you know, this is where things like Loop are really powerful, because things like number 23, during sleep blood sugars, you know, Loop can really, and automated insulin delivery, it really takes that factor off the table in a way that we don't have when we're not on a closed loop system, just because of how glucose changes minute to minute. Of course, a lot of factors are absolutely still in play and just as complicated on Loop. In fact, probably almost everything on this list is still there to some extent. But I think what you know, closed loop systems do allow is they take some of this complexity off the table, and that's really meaningful. And I think they add on a layer of psychological burden and stress that I definitely want to spend some time talking about, especially as I step more into psychology and kind of work with folks battling all kinds of different, whether it's an eating disorder, trauma, anxiety, what goes on inside and how does that show up in people's lives? So one of the ways that I think is a helpful analogy is I sometimes talk about this as like diabetes is like a really complicated stereo system with at least 42 knobs. And the combined output of the knobs, produces a sound quality. And in this analogy, we could call that what your blood glucose is. So each knob is a factor. And, it would be great if we were able to kind of tinker with all the knobs and get just the right settings and keep glucose in range. I think the problem and the challenge of diabetes is that we don't have access to all the knobs. Some of the knobs are just locked off. So you could imagine some of the factors on the previous slide, like you do not have any control over. I don't really have a lot of control over whether I have infusion set issues or not. Like sometimes they arise and sometimes they don't. And maybe there's some patterns, but for the most part, it's pretty hard to control that. Same with things like stress. There are some, if some days we just have a lot of stress and it shows up and it affects our glucose and we have to deal with it. And so I think what's hard about this is that it's like we're all carrying this really complicated stereo system every day, and yet you don't have access to all the knobs, and the settings change every day. Some days you're dealing with a completely different basket of knob settings than other days. And again, this is what makes type 1 diabetes so maddening. And then I think one of the things that's tricky about CGM and loop is that there is a temptation to constantly tinker, to check and check and check and tinker and tinker and tinker. And that can create this huge time suck and psychological burden. Like if only I could spend more time tinkering or gathering more data, I could solve this. And I want to actually encourage folks to pause and see if that system has worked for them, because I certainly could go to those sorts of places, but at least a few years ago. And I think one of the things I've had to learn is actually to step back from the tinkering and step back from the data analysis. And I've noticed that my blood sugars are actually the exact same as they were when I was doing all of that, but I have a lot more psychological freedom and time to do things that matter to me. Because at the end of the day, to me, the goal is not to have the highest time in range. It's to live my life bringing diabetes along the way and to not let it get in the way of what matters to me, which does require keeping my glucose in a range that keeps me, functioning optimally. But to me, diabetes is not job number one. The job is to live my life, and I'm bringing diabetes along the way. And I think this is a little bit different framing than I might have had a few years ago. And I think that just reflects my own journey, but happy to talk more about that in Q&A. So I think this analogy can be helpful for kind of noticing how much complexity we're dealing with and what we're up to here. And tied to this, I'll just take something from Bright Spots and Landmines that I don't think folks can hear this enough, especially folks who are very tied to their data. The data, the blood sugar numbers, these are neutral information to make decisions. There are no good or bad numbers. They're not grades. They're definitely not tests. It's information, it's data. It helps us make decisions. And I think once we start adding value judgments on the numbers, and if you spend any time with a group of people with type 1 diabetes, you'll hear this creep in immediately. I have a bad number right now. I had a bad number this morning. I had a bad low. I'm a bad diabetic. You'll just hear the value judgments creeping in. And I think that does a lot of harm to folks, because it can lead to, if it's a bad number, I did something wrong. And I don't think that, for me at least, that doesn't take me anywhere valuable, but it does drag me down a lot. It does create a lot of self-criticism and frustration that isn't really productive for me. And so one of the things that and I'm often helping clients with this, it's really the difference between description and evaluation. So if I said, I'm holding up a mug here, like this is the best mug in the world. You might look at that mug and say, actually, no, I have the best mug in the world. I own a really great mug. And I might say, but this is the best. Your mug is bad and mine is good. And we could have an endless debate over which mug is better and who is the best mug. And that would be evaluation. But notice the difference with description. This is a really large mug. This is a like bluish gray mug. This is a mug that can hold 28 ounces of liquid.
Mm-hmm.
Notice that there's a neutralness with that. And I think that is so key to approach our data in the same way. I think that can really change the tone of diabetes in a way that's really important. Sometimes I liken this to a speedometer in a car. Like the speedometer is information to inform driving. So we wouldn't say, wow, I'm going too fast. What a bad speed number, or I'm a bad driver. For the most part, we would say, okay, I need to change how I'm driving right now. And you could imagine even an airline pilot, flying from San Francisco to Tokyo, and this pilot is checking the instrumentation and notices, wow, like the plane is a little bit off course. The action would be to course correct based on the data and information. But not to say I'm a terrible pilot. I'm a bad pilot. There's no use in me even trying, worthless, or to endlessly tinker. Like at a certain point, there is an action to be taken based on the data. And then it's like, okay, now let's course correct and just step back and see. And I think what's really hard about CGM and loop is it can, because the data is so right there in your face and it's so accessible, which is a beautiful thing, it can also bring these value judgments and this like, I feel like it's almost like you're making a fist, and then you keep tightening the fist and tightening the fist and tightening the fist. And that's sometimes what I feel like with the diabetes data. It can feel like that if we're gripping too hard. And so I'm just offering like different ways I kind of think about these things now. Now that I work with a lot of folks struggling with different things, and it just helps me hold it all a little bit lighter. Not that I don't care about the data, I actually use it just as much, but I'm not obsessed about it. And I think that creates a real psychological freedom. The last piece I'll mention just with these 42 factors is that with a lot of things in medicine, in biology, in mental health, things go in these like really intense interconnected feedback loops. And so I'll just give you one example that shows up for me. So today, in fact, actually, I went to a friend, their son had a birthday party. And so we went up to Marin and went to that. And there was this like huge, giant free coffee urn at this birthday thing. And so I had like far too much coffee. And it was really delicious coffee and it was totally worth it. And I have a feeling that it's going to be hard for me to fall asleep tonight because caffeine has an 8-hour half-life. And I definitely had a lot of caffeine today. So caffeine obviously impacts my sleep. And sleep is something, actually, after writing Bright Spots and Landmines, I really, really appreciate how much of diabetes sleep affects in less obvious ways. And so one of the ways sleep affects me is like, I am a more stressed person. I spiral more cognitively. I'm more anxious when I don't get enough sleep. I'm also more tired, obviously, when I don't get enough sleep. And those two things combined tend to impact my desire to exercise and my ability to exercise the next day. And so often what shows up is then I don't exercise and then I feel extra tired and then I reach for more caffeine. And you can see how just that simple cycle could repeat again and again and again. And these are just 5 variables here. And of course, if there's 42 variables in play, you could see how patterns could repeat and repeat and repeat in ways that just feed on each other. And so again, I think this just makes diabetes super, super complicated. Oh, in fact, here is nice arrows to illustrate this feedback loop. And I would say like lots of things in diabetes are like this. This is just one example around caffeine, but we could draw a similar one around exercise for me, or a similar one around different foods I like to eat, or that sort of thing. So this is to say like all of these things are interrelated. And where I'm going with this is that, and I'll stop sharing now, but how do I stop sharing? Pause share? No, stop share. Ah, there we are. Where I'm going with this is that when unpredictable blood sugars show up, there is a choice around self-criticism and tightening and contraction, or being curious, taking action, holding it with kindness. And what I end up doing with a lot of folks that I work with is just like teaching them to have the same compassion for themselves that they have for other people in their lives who are struggling. This is called self-compassion, and it's a very learnable skill. And I think it's really, really helpful with diabetes because we're all managing something really challenging. And we can greet that with a harshness and a criticism, or a compassion and a kindness. And along the way, like the tools we have are super helpful and amazing, and they can also drive a sort of intensity. And yeah, so I don't know, those are some of the things I've been thinking about lately, and curious to hear what folks have to say. Feel free to disagree. Like I'm not out here to say I'm right. But yeah, we'll leave it at that.
I just want to jump in on this. Absolutely on compassion. I've said this over the time of COVID when we've been doing presentations, is please remember you're doing a lot. It's very hard to manage. It's exhausting. There's so much to it. Give yourself the pat on the back and lighten up. But is there, when you work with your patients or your clients, do you give them a sticker they put on their computer monitor? Do they do a rubber band on their wrists that they snap to remind themselves to be compassionate? It's hard. It's so constant.
Yeah, well, those are all great ideas. Maybe I'll guide. Can I guide folks through something just to like get a taste of what this is like? Okay. So I'll guide you through this for a couple minutes. I think this will be easier if you're willing to close your eyes. I think this exercise is a little bit easier, but if you're not willing to close your eyes, finding somewhere in the room where you can just kind of let your gaze get soft will be helpful. So what I'll ask you to do is just first, like, notice what it's like to sit where you're sitting right now, what it feels like to have the support of the chair, what it feels like if your feet are touching the ground, like what that feels like. And I'd like you to bring to mind someone in your life that you love, that you care about, that matters to you. See if you could bring them to mind. Like you might bring their image to mind, you might think of their name, you might see them in your mind. And I want you to keep them in your mind, and I'm going to ask you to repeat some phrases. You can make up your own if these don't resonate, but I want you to send them some phrases like, may you be happy. May you be free from suffering. May you live a life of peace and joy and ease. May you be healthy. And if your mind starts to wander, which minds love to do, bring it back to this person. Start again. May you be happy. May you be free from suffering. May you live a life of peace and joy and ease. May you be healthy. And you might even picture this person like radiantly happy, really having an amazing moment. You really see them living life on their terms. And just see if you can get a sense of like what this feels like to send this person that you love this kindness, this person that you care about. And then the last thing I'll ask you to do is imagine this person sending it back to you. This person who also loves you, imagine them sending that same kindness back to you. May I be happy. May I be free from suffering. May I live a life of peace and joy and ease. May I be healthy. And when you're ready, you can come back to the room we're in. Notice what you can hear and what you can see. So that is a really simple, I'll say most folks find it very easy to send compassion to someone they care about. Very hard to send it back to themselves. I would say that's a universal experience. And the skill we're trying to build here is that ability to treat ourselves with the same compassion and kindness that we would treat someone else. And for some folks, this is hard, right? It's like, well, self-criticism feels safer. I'll lose my edge if I'm kind to myself. And I just invite you to experiment with this. See what happens.
It would be an interesting exercise for all of us in the volunteer community to include that. We do a lot of making sure you're safe, making sure you're able to build things and get good results. Mm-hmm. But we often don't also say, you know, may you be gentle on yourself. Mm-hmm. I don't know, Marion, when's the last time you said that to anybody building?
Trying to unmute here. As a matter of fact, that's one of my mantras. When someone says I'm so stupid, I say, you know, don't do that. And also on Facebook, people will accuse themselves of somehow being, I don't know, I have repeatedly said, you know, you wouldn't say that to someone else, don't say it to yourself. But I try to say it more kindly, you know, because you don't want to beat someone up for saying something that they aren't even thinking about. So
I don't think we hear it enough, and I think I think that's real important. Diabetes is a scary thing. Yeah, consequences are scary. So they sit in us, they exist. But to have that at the same time is helpful. I'm gonna toss this to Syra. Syra is a T1D. She's married to a T1D. Her two precious little girls have type 1 diabetes. They all have some sort of loops and alarms going on in their house. I can't even imagine. How does this play into how you interact with your family?
So I think to some extent I'm forced to be more compassionate to myself because I have to model what I want my children to do. And they're excellent at looking at what I do and not what I say. So it's that example of, for example, like you're high and you're still going to eat sugar or eat ice cream because you know what, it just feels like a day for ice cream kind of a thing. So to your point, Adam, of like the number is just a number, it's going to change in 5 minutes. It's kind of how we live in this household because somebody is pretty much always out of range, most likely. And it's not like that, oh, you're in good range right now. So I know you had asked a question about how my kids respond to like bad numbers. And I'd like to think that they don't really know the concept of bad. It's more like, okay, when you're low, for them, it's exciting because they get low treatments and they're still on that stage where they like all the different low treatments, and we try to keep them on rotation so it doesn't get too boring. But the highs, I'd like to think, are not something they consider as bad because it's not something that they have to do anything about. Like they don't ever know it outside of how they feel, right? Like if it's like a really, really crappy, got ketones kind of high, then obviously they know the physical impact of it. But I'd like to hope that they don't consider good and bad numbers. They just are what they are. Especially in this house where that number, like there's usually somebody in one variation of a bad number in her house at any given time. So yeah, that and the whole leading by example thing being forced upon us. Yeah, I don't know if the concept of being a good or bad diabetic really exists in our household right now.
That's an interesting concept of being the role model. So those of us who are adults who are just doing our stuff, not for children, I don't know that we're always good stewards of role models for ourselves. Because we're so caught up in it. I kind of want to look at prioritizing the most important factors. You had the sleep and the exercise, and I've spoken to some of our admins who have young kids, but they're the diabetic, and if you need to get sleep, and they laugh. And yeah, sometime. How do you share that and be a good community member without shaming you and saying you have to sleep? How can all of us be helpful to each other? We are a volunteer community and trying to be helpful. How do we do that?
Is that a question for me?
Yes, it is.
Oh, okay. I thought it was back. Can you rephrase it? Because I don't think I fully tracked it, and I want to make sure I did. Yeah.
How do we be helpful to our members, our friends who are living with what I will call a burden, because it is something that we didn't choose. I don't get paid very well for it. In fact, it costs enough. How do we help them when they say later, I'll get to the important factors later, I'm busy, I have too much to do? Is there a way of reminding people without putting more burden on them? No could be an answer. It's enough of a burden. I once I wrote a book, and it was how much time it takes, included in that, with how much time it takes to be a diabetic and how many hours a week you actually spend, if you look at it, tracking down insurance, prior authorizations, doctor's appointments, refilling prescriptions, checking your blood sugar, filling pods, whatever you do.
Yeah.
It's a lot.
Yeah. Okay. I'm just going to riff on this. I don't know if any of this will be helpful, but I think about this a lot now that I'm like a mental health professional. sometimes I'll work with a client and it will be like fairly obvious what needs to happen to me. I'll sort of know like what can make things better.
Okay.
And sometimes it's not that case. So there's a helpful analogy from the model I practice from, which is ACT. Are clients sunsets or math problems? Are clients sunsets or math problems? I'll explain. Math problems are there to be solved. In fact, if I showed you 2 + 2, your mind would just answer it. Minds love problems. They'll solve them. Sunsets are not like math problems. They are to be appreciated. They are to be curious about. They are to be noticed. And so when I am at my best as a mental health professional, I am sitting across from someone and appreciating them like a sunset. Yes, I'm committed to something different for them, something better, and bringing in some knowledge, where it might be valuable from a stance of humility and curiosity. But when I treat someone across from me like they're a math problem, I am by far at my worst. I know better than you. Oh, I've been here before. You should just. That is a good indication that I am coming in from a stance of above. You should just. Versus, or but. When a but is coming up. So that is one way I think about it. Like, how do I approach someone, appreciate them from like just a human on this path of struggle, offer them something valuable that could help them, and it is up to them to take it and run with it or not. And if they don't run with it, there are probably very good reasons why. So I don't have enough time to tinker or to adjust settings. Like, yeah, I could see how that would be the case. And if what someone is doing isn't working for them, one thing I can sometimes offer is like, hey, I actually notice this doesn't seem like it's working for you. However, I think all of this is very hard to do in like a Facebook group format. So I don't know if I really answered your question, but that's one of the ways that I approach it. And it takes a little bit of the pressure off of me as well.
Got it. So I want to toss this over to Tina and Phil. Sorry, I caught you mid-yawn, Phil. And you're dealing with a teenager. Let's call him a teenager. He's a year from it, maybe, but maybe he is. How do you give yourselves grace? How do you adjust the corrections you have to make and the burden you feel or the fatigue you feel?
You want to answer that?
I need to think.
Oh,
you go first.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm just coming into that. Just starting to, or just recently have started trying to relax a bit and trust the people who, the very well-studied and well-known people who tell us you don't have to be that low and that tight. Because I actually like the tinkering and I like the working on the data, which I wish it were a different topic, but I'm thankful that at least, I don't hate every single second of it. But I'm just really trying to say, okay, I trust these people that the whole world has, the ability to listen to and hear the same thing as I'm hearing from them. And I think, and I also trust the people like Joanne and Marion and Glenn and Phil, who's not here right now, who have had this in their lives for many, many years and didn't have the tools that we have now to be able to track the blood sugars and to keep in a tighter range and stuff. And, you know, there are many people that didn't have those assets that also don't have, you know, the outcomes that I have been like working so hard to avoid in these early years. And so I think there is plenty of room for grace on my part. And honestly, my goal is, you know, to get to transition so that Reese is able to, you know, when it's time for him to go off on his own, for him to walk out with, you know, everything he needs in hand and be confident and competent to handle this, for the most part, you know, on his own, and feel settled. And so that's what, you know, that's what I'm working for, and that makes me have to give myself more grace too.
You, I guess on a day-to-day basis, just because we homeschool, so Reese is with Tina much more of the time than he is with me, so it's you know, different. But when I am the primary watcher and helper, it's trying to not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And also, you know, as Adam noted, trying to live life and do things and, you know, manage this as a part. An analogy that Rehan Lal told to us one time, which is just spot on for me, and I think for Tina also. All of this data, he said, his objective is not to get the highest score in the video game, but to be able to keep playing the game, you know, so get the score that's good enough to keep playing. And that really is, both of us come from a biology background. We find the science around it very fascinating. We like numbers. And so the temptation is to just tinker enough to get that better score and to really, you know, put the value judgment around that. Was it a good day or a bad day? And so to kind of focus on that, let's just, you know, make it through. And, oh, well, these things weren't great. Let's see if we can learn from that and make it less stressful next time. Hamburgers are a great example of that. It's like, we've learned how to handle a hamburger,
And
you know, a nice big burger with fries. And I'm probably making Reese hungry by saying this, but it's like, yeah, we can handle that now. And that's great. Not to stress about it. Just every once in a while, have boys burger night.
How does Reese feel about that?
About what?
About letting go, it's just a number. Does he feel the same way? I'm trying to remember when I was 11.
Honestly, we're struggling right now with highs. And I don't know if he's on the verge of illness or if we did a site change earlier today, because I was like, I think it's the site not absorbing well. And it's been better since then, but there's still been some highs. But he's you know, it's in the upper hundreds and coming down, but he's not feeling his best. And so, you know, that tells me, okay, the range, not that we're trying to be up there, but the range needs to be maybe not down as close as we would have liked, you know, way back, but closer to that.
But I can't resist jumping in here. I hope it's okay. So I'll just flag, like, notice how you're, like, my mind does the same, like it goes to work, like trying to figure it out. You notice that? Like just in that little bit you said, right? and I'm at 223 right now. And there are some pretty good reasons I can identify for why that is the case. At least 4 are in play right now. Towards the end of an infusion set, I always get higher. Had some bread at dinner. Nervous for this talk. And probably, some other thing I'm not thinking of.
No, you had a
Yeah.
ton of coffee.
And the coffee. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, probably the coffee. Yeah. Totally. So for me, it's not so much about figuring out what it is, but responding to now. And I just know I can waste a lot of my own mental energy, trying to solve the math problem in a way that takes me out of my life. So I think this is where I've sort of changed my frame, and it's different for you, you're a parent. So I get that. But I think that's where I've really changed my frame in the past 4 or 5 years in this. So I don't know if that's helpful, but because it was something in real time, I just couldn't resist.
That's great.
Well, you said at one point you kind of take a step back from solving the math problems. Do you have a duty cycle where you every 2 weeks you say, well, overall, how have I been doing when I've been letting it go? Or once a week, do you check in, or do you?
That's a great question.
Yeah. What's so interesting? I mean, I think this will be different for everyone, but I actually switched to Tandem in the new year. So I've been on the Tandem pump. I get the same outcomes on Tandem as I got on Loop, for me personally. I don't download Declarity anymore. I don't get the Dexcom on my phone. I don't have an Apple Watch. I don't track my steps anymore. All of it is the same. It's all the same. But I have more freedom to be in my life and not be thinking about diabetes all of the time. So I tend to look at my pump when I get an alarm, a high or low, or when I'm about to eat, and that's it. And it's all the same as what I did on Loop, what I got on Loop. So to me, it's wow, this is a great trade.
Yeah, we're focused on the technology and making it work and making sure people understand how it works.
Yes.
But the important part is also how to live your life, and that's where this was so important. We all want to know about research. We want to know the new technology. We want to know how to make it sing and dance and do everything right. But yes, we're trying to also figure out how to not be scared of the negative consequences and live our lives. And that is the benefit of what we get to hear today, is how do you step away from it and trust? I think Tina used the word trust. You trust the technology. You let it run. You get it working. That's what we help you do. You get it kind of fine-tuned. That's what the community helps with. And then step back, as he said, step back. We don't hear that a lot.
I just want to say thank you, Adam, for coming to talk to us. I think you've raised an issue that's so important for all of us type 1s to think about, and that is to remember to live our lives. I just see this all as a really difficult balancing act. On the one hand, you really do have to look at your numbers. And for me, I feel horrible if I go too high or too low. So I have to spend a certain amount of time. And I really have spent a lot of time analyzing. I keep hoping that I'm going to get to a point where I can just let it be and go live my life. But I do think there is, some period of time that people have to go through analyzing their data and trying to get their settings right, because it's very challenging, especially with all the different factors. And I have to say, I'm so grateful to Loop because you have so many tools to use too, with overrides and exercise and all these crazy things that change your blood glucose. So I don't think it's really an easy, I think each of us at different stages of our life have a different balance between just live my life and try and get this under control so I can feel good. And to me, it's so interesting to hear you now talk about where you are, because you've obviously gone through, you've gone through the period where you figured out as much as you can how to do your settings or what, pump you want to be on. And now you can live your life. And I hope all of us can get there. So it's not a question, it was just a comment.
Thanks, Ellen. And I see Brad has a hand raised.
Yeah, and thank you. I also
Hey,
have,
Brad.
I guess, is a comment, but Adam, I also want to show some gratitude. Thank you so much for your words. Echoing a little bit of what Ellen said, what came to my mind as you were speaking, Ellen, is sometimes we don't feel bad about the blood sugars. We just feel bad. When you're on a roller coaster day, it just doesn't feel good. Like physically and mentally, just doesn't feel good. So, there's this desire to strive towards achieving a flat line before we're dead, as opposed to the flat line after we're dead. And it is extraordinarily challenging. I actually, I'm moving back down to the Bay Area. I'm currently in Sacramento and I'm moving back down there. Thanks, Marion. On November 16th is my move date. I'm really looking forward to being back down there. Much more, how do I say it? It's much better. But I thought I would dummy down a little bit because Loop has so many levers and I want to own them all and be the master of them all. But I had a brain tumor years ago, and I talk about giving yourself a little bit of grace. Like, I used to be able to do this. Now I'm just not able to do this. And that's difficult. So I thought I would dummy it down to Tandem. And I've been on Tandem before, but I'm missing my levers. It's weird. Like I don't have carbs on board, and that itself is giving me stress, right? So to some extent, it's staying with what that gives you the least amount of anxiety. There will always be anxiety, but giving yourself the least amount of anxiety and doing the best you can and being forgiving of yourself. I can speak it. I have yet to actually have it happen in my heart and my mind. But once again, thank you, Adam. I appreciate it.
You're very welcome. I appreciated what you said. I want to just comment on one thing that stood out to me was I think a lot of us have this experience in diabetes of comparison. And comparison goes in a lot of directions. One way that we compare ourselves is to how we used to be. Right? I used to be X, Y, and Z, and now I'm not. And something I've been working on is remembering, like, I am how I am now. And that's what I have to work with. And the comparison to how it once was, while interesting, while a fun math problem perhaps, doesn't actually take me anywhere valuable because I am the way I am now. And this also works. I think social media can amplify some of this when folks are like sharing their flatline graphs or whatever. And I'm whatever 230 right now. It can feel like, oh, they've got it right and I don't. And again, like stepping out of comparison into like, okay, this is where I am right now, and how am I going to respond? How am I going to have like a toolkit that works for me? How am I going to work with what I've got, a place of acceptance? That can be really powerful, and also taking away some of the value judgments that kind of like sneak their way in, even to like how Adam I used to be versus how I am now. Yeah, so I noticed that in what you said, and I was like, I can't resist.
I think there's a very valuable lesson that you'll be able to share the message on as we get older as well. There's a thread in our community, because I'm very well aware of aging and type 1 diabetes, and the question has been raised very recently, last week. Oh my gosh, as someone said, I'm 70 years old, who's going to run my loop? oh my gosh, what am I going to be able to do? And how do I let go, or how do I trust? And I think that's something we all have to deal with at some point. Different times, and parents have to let go of their kids to go to college and trust that they will wake up with alarms and not drink too much. Good luck. But I mean, it's that's life. But we have the extra burden that gives us boundaries and also makes us feel bad. So I want to throw this back out to anybody who has any other question for Adam. I'm just very grateful for this. We don't talk about this much. Go ahead, Mary.
Yeah, it isn't really a question. It's something I heard Adam bring up early on, and I just wanted to emphasize. We have a lot of knobs in our toolbox, but we don't have to sit there and twiddle them back and forth. Because if you sit there and twiddle them back and forth, trying to, fix this and fix that and fix the other thing and fix this, you may very well wind up driving an oscillation that you really don't want. And I've done it. I'm certainly, and I can sit back and recognize that I know exactly what I did and why this happened. I need to step back and not do that oscillation ahead. There's a couple of simple tools in your toolbox, pre-bolusing. If you mess up on the meal, maybe take a walk after. There's some very simple tools that you can do that help make your life better without stressing about how did I screw up. It's really hard to change that language and not beat yourself up. And I just want to thank Adam once again for bringing up some of these topics.
I actually had asked Carol to look at my data because I was doing so well and I didn't understand because I wasn't touching knobs. And I said, please look at my night scale. Please just, what am I doing that's making this work well? And she said, what do you care? It's working. And yes, okay, leave it alone. Yes, that's an important point to make.
But the knob tinkering is very seductive, and it makes us feel like, okay, I'm working hard. I'm working on my diabetes. I'm doing something. And I think that's so interesting, Joanne, that you were like, things are going pretty well. What? I need to figure out why. And it's like, yes, totally. So that's very true.
Mhm.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to say that you had an aviation, a pilot analogy there early on, and one of the things that you learn early in pilot training is what they call pilot induced oscillation. If you're trying to hold a steady altitude and you do a little forward stick, a little back, and you make it worse. And the thing the instructor does is slaps your hand and says, let go.
He does that a lot.
The airplane will level itself out. If you have settings close to right, the airplane will level itself out.
Yeah, my husband's a retired engineer, and he says, don't keep touching things. Stop touching things. But we talk to people, they say, how are my settings, or what do I do? I guess we just need to be mindful. When is enough? My endo asked me that. I said, how do I get my A1C just a little bit lower? And he said, what is your point? And I think we have to be very mindful of that. We can make it a little tighter, but at what cost?
I have a question for you, Adam. I have always wondered this for the past 3 years. What age were you when you got involved in the diabetes advocacy realm that led you to write the book? And do you feel like when people get involved at a younger age, that puts them at any kind of risk of getting burnt out more? Or do you think it might help keep them from getting burnt out?
Oh, fabulous questions. Okay, I got involved at 21 after college. I wanted nothing to do with the diabetes community for the first 20 years of my life.
Wow.
I did get burned out in 2019, and that is part of why I went to grad school and I'm doing some other things, and I'll come back. But it was like 24/7. Like, I live with diabetes. It was my professional career. It was a lot. And I was like, wow, I need to like go explore some other things, you know? So I don't know, I guess, is the answer to your question. I can just reflect my experience on that. I think if young folks are like, yeah, I want to like mentor other people with diabetes, or I want to like get involved, like, amazing. Like, we shouldn't discourage that. But if we're like pushing people in, that feels a little like, I don't know. Does that resonate, or I don't know.
yeah.
That's just my own experience.
Yeah.
I would
Yeah,
tend to
I-
think it's driven by race. I was involved with going to Washington when I was 12, 13, 14. And it was exciting. And then it was like too much. And I stepped away for probably 20 years. I don't want to know about this enough. So I think it's driven by the young person. And us old people too. At some point you go, too much diabetes, too much loop and learn, too much loop, too much. What else should I be doing? What else could I do that's fun? Unless writing documentation is fun, then you do that. I think you keep evaluating, am I in a good space? Is this a good space to be in for me now, or my child now? Reese will tell you he's very verbal. Syra, I'm sure you know your kids inside and out, and they are very verbal. And they're so surrounded by it, you have to be keenly aware of how much exposure they have.
Yeah, I think I worry about the opposite about me being in the space now. And like Adam, I wanted nothing to do with it for probably most of my life. But it seems like it just kept coming back to be like, just kidding, you can't get away from this with, you know, me meeting my husband and then the kids. That it felt like the world was like, you can make a difference here. So that's what you should be doing. And it feels right for me right now. But I think one, I'm conscious of whether or not at some point that would be too much for my kids. I don't think my work impacts them personally. I don't think they even know what I do, honestly. They're 5 and 7. They think I work on a computer all day. But what's helpful is, you know, they have my husband who's in something totally different. He works in construction and like nothing to do with diabetes. So they have the opposite role model again. But then also I think in line with this entire topic today is knowing what you do and don't have control over, whether that's knobs, whether that's how much you think about the knobs, whether it's how much you let them impact you, is all kind of what it comes down to, right? Like we all know, for example, you know, you don't, I guess in a weird way, I also tried switching to Tandem, and for me, it didn't work for a couple of reasons, partly because I needed access to edit carbs. And then 2, for me to make that mind switch for what was working for my kids versus what I was using was just way too much mind switching from like one system to the other. But that option to look at loop, honestly, is one thing. Knowing that you can, for example, turn your alarms to a wider range in any given week or month or whatever it is always an option. All sorts of things to give yourself a break, and whenever you need it is always something you can do. And then the other part, based on what you had said earlier, Tina, I think there's a really big difference in being gracious to yourself for your own numbers is one thing, but for your kids is a whole another ball game, because it's not their fault. At least for mine right now, they're 5 and 7. It's never their fault, right? If they're high or they're low, it's totally on me, because they're not managing anything. I mean, it's their highs and their lows, and I don't feel any of the physiological aspects of diabetes for them. But like they didn't screw up their diabetes management, if that makes sense, right? So if they're not in a good number, that's on me. So that blame as a parent and that lack of graciousness as a parent is very different. What I like to tell people I don't know if this is fair or not, but being a parent, as someone who has both, being a parent of somebody with type 1 is harder, for me at least, than being the person with type 1. I don't think it's fair for any parent to be like, oh, I have it harder than you, because your kid's not gonna like that. But it's just a very different burden to hold as a parent than it is to be a person with diabetes, because you're always gonna have all these different layers of guilt added in. I don't think I can answer. That's not helpful, but I think it's harder to be gracious as a parent than it is as a person with diabetes, was my whole point around that.
Sarah, I have to tell you, when I was diagnosed at 11, when I was 35, I thanked my parents. It took that long until I realized how much they went through. I was angry. So I was sort of torturing them. I could twist them in a moment. Didn't realize I was doing it. I had no power otherwise. But so if you can wait like 30 years, you're good.
And Zaira, just one thing that really stood out to me in what you shared was around, you know, if their numbers are out of range, it's not their fault, it's my fault. And I'll just flag for you, like, probably not your fault.
But yeah,
probably diabetes in all of its insane complexity, and you being an amazing parent and doing everything you can and having all the tools and using them, and blood sugars happen, and that's not your fault. That's honestly like the only thing I wanted to communicate tonight, is like, it is probably not your fault.
thank you. I appreciate that. The goal around that comment was more of like, it's definitely not on them, but I hear you. You're right. And that's that taking it upon us is like that. Like I said, it's easier to say it's not my fault when it's my numbers, but when it's the kids, it's just that it's like a whole different level of feeling blame, I suppose, is what I was trying to go for.
Totally. Yeah, it makes me feel like the mental health, like psychological aspects of type 1 diabetes are so much harder on parents than on the people with diabetes themselves.
I don't know if harder is fair to say, because I know if somebody had said that to me as a kid, like saying, oh, your mom has it harder than you, I would not have taken that well, because I didn't know their struggle. I would have been like, but I'm the one dealing with it, right? But to your point, I don't think parents are given as much attention as they deserve, but that's because I'm selfishly can be like, I can say both, which I know is not the case for most people, but yeah, it's a whole different level of hard as a parent, because you usually love your kids more than you care about yourselves.
Well, Adam, this is just amazing. My head is buzzing. You just said one thing that I'm just going to hold on to, just put it on a Post-it note, that diabetes has insane complexity. That's just such an amazing reality to keep in your mind. It's I do some work with Lane Desborough, who was early on in the hashtag We Are Not Waiting. He kind of was the one who coined the phrase, and I saw a presentation he did, and he said diabetes is a data disease, and there's so much data, it's complex. And I had a researcher say the pancreas is only second to the brain in complexity. So we're all doing an amazing job. We're doing an impossible task. And I thank you for talking this way. Most people don't want to talk about this. And I think it's as much a part of management as your settings and which pump you use. It's how we live. So, and if you're a parent, thank you. Good job. You're doing a great job. And if you're a type 1 diabetic, you're doing a good job. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Just keep doing what you do. Come talk to us anytime you want to talk to us. We'll set this up.
Right on. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for showing up tonight, and we'll see you all again in the next year. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Happy Thanksgiving, Happy
you.
New Year's, everyone.